Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion, and here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes. We are alive. We are alive on a Monday. It is the day before Election Day. It is the 7th day of November in the year 2016. And after too long a time away from the Virtual Center, I just had to come back. And I know that a lot of people, if I asked them, but I didn't, why are you doing a program today with tomorrow being the election? Shouldn't you be here? Shouldn't you be doing that? And my response, the way I rationalized it in my own mind is, I'm not Donald Trump and I can't fly to 4 states in one day. So therefore, I'm going to consider my campaign a done deal, and I'm going to get back to the things that are important in my life and hopefully in a few other people's lives as well. And I will be picking up my campaign signs on Wednesday, whatever the results of the election tomorrow. And of course, that's what everybody's asking me, is about whether in fact I have any sense as to how we're going to do. And I don't. I mean, I don't have any sense, to be honest with you, about the national election between Hillary and Donald Trump. I thought I had that one nailed down, but like everybody else did, but it changes daily. And I think after hearing 35 different polls, I've decided to ignore the polls. I think this may be the one thing that Donald Trump is right about. I don't think and polls know what they're doing. And he may be correct on that. Anyway, welcome to a Monday edition of the Virtual Center, an absolutely gorgeous Monday in early November. We're looking at bright sunshine, blue skies. We have just had an absolutely spectacular month here in Appalachia, deficient with rain, and I'm concerned about that because we really haven't not had enough rain. But the weather has been so gorgeous that I keep telling myself, oh, maybe it'll rain tomorrow. Maybe it'll rain tomorrow, but I don't want to lose today. So anyway, I do notice the long-term forecasts here are projecting that we will be only into the 40s by the end of the week. So we may be nearing the end of this, I don't know, I guess I don't think we can call it Indian summer since we never had any winter in between. But it is an absolutely gorgeous day here, and I hope that it is where you are as well. We're predicting perfect weather for the elections tomorrow. So very honestly, from the perspective of Democrats, that's a good thing. And you just keep looking for little tiny things to kind of hang on to. And but anyway, it's been an unbelievable ride. Personally, for me, being involved in a campaign for the first time in my life, and I'm sure for everybody else, and I'm hearing so many people say that they'll be glad when it's over. And a friend of mine who's probably more of a political junkie than I am, made the point, and he said, if this thing was to continue much longer, we'd all be dead. I mean, the stress level and this ups and downs, and I don't think any of us could sustain these for much longer. But anyway, to our program today. First of all, welcome. I just felt that on this, the final day before the elections, I probably couldn't accomplish nearly as much that's positive in the final day of a campaign that has been running for months. That would be as important as what I might be able to sustain and accomplish by revisiting live the Virtual Center and trying to get back a little bit into some of the issues and some of the things that really drive me. Not that the campaign hasn't and doesn't. But yesterday I put a piece on Facebook in which I tried to thank the many people that I've run across during the course of this campaign. Many of them didn't vote for me. Many of them probably voted for my opponent, but that's not the issue. I met some wonderful people. I've seen some parts of the state, of this particular state, that just have to be some of the prettiest places that I've ever seen on the face of God's green earth. Absolutely spectacular. And the third thing that I would say is my heaven, when people say some of these folks that live in the mountains can really cook, they know what they're talking about. Some of these campaign events that I've gone to where dinner is served, homemade dinner and homemade casseroles and steak and gravy and brown beans and cornbread and absolutely unbelievable. So again, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm telling myself this, of course, if I don't win, I'm going to be disappointed. But the fact of the matter is I've already won. And it's one of those once-in-a-lifetime experiences that I wouldn't exchange for anything. I'm probably not going to do it again because it's too stressful. And not only on me, but those closest to me as well. My wife has been incredible in this, and she's seen me dart here, there, and everywhere, miss meals, saying I'm going to be home, and then at the last minute calling to say I'm not, and on and on and on. She's been so understanding and so supportive through all of this. But she did say one night last week in a weak moment, if you ever do anything like this again, I'll kill you. So I took that message for what it's worth. And I kind of think that the years I have left with her, hopefully years, are far and away more important than campaigning and politics and all the rest of it. And so, I think I'm trying to get all my ducks in a row and get my priorities straight in the face of the end of the campaign and the decisions that will be known to everybody tomorrow evening. And then we have the rest of our lives to live. And I want to make sure that I live it and live it well, putting the right things in front and the right things that shouldn't be in front to the rear, as they ought to be. So again, welcome to the Virtual Center. Thank you so very much for your continued support. On the road, I've told infinite numbers of people about the Virtual Center. Many of them have asked for the call-in address, where they can get it, where they can listen, and the rest of it. And I've told them about YouTube, and I've told them about whiterosesociety.org and all of those things. But there's nothing like being here and being live. So again, I look forward to today. I cherish it. I cherish the opportunity. I'll never take it for granted. I never have, and I never will. So with that, let me see if I can remember the phone number and share some of these household duties with you. And then, first time we've done that for a while. We do have a phone number. I do invite you to call. Agnes is in the Head On Radio Network studios, and she will get you on the air if you do call. I know I would love to hear from you, and I know our other listeners would as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. I would also encourage you to take a look at our Facebook page. We have a Virtual Center Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, to the home page, and you go to the search box at the top, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be into our Facebook page. I've continued to put a few pieces on the Facebook page, not as regularly as I was doing it when we were doing our regular programs live. But this weekend I did get back, and I put a couple of links to a few pieces on there. And I'm going to basically devote our programs for the first couple of days to try to fill the gaps and catch up on some things and some issues that I had lined up for our attention here at the Virtual Center, and they've just sat there for several days. And I'd like to address a number of them. I'd like to throw out an article right now because, very honestly, let me just say this. I say this without reservation. This may be, in terms of understanding some of the things that are going on in the nation today, politically, socially, economically, and every other way, but more importantly, the ways that all of these interconnect and interact and have an effect one on the other. There was an article that was published a few weeks ago, actually not a few weeks ago, about a week ago, 10 days ago, in the New Yorker magazine. The author is George Packer, Packer. Some of you may be familiar with George Packer. He's been writing for the New Yorker for a number of years, since 2003, I believe. And some of his articles are some of the most perceptive, well-written pieces. And of course, that's what the New Yorker is all about. I think that one thing everybody would agree on is what appears in the New Yorker is some of the best written material that's being put out today. And George Packer is one of the best. This appeared in the October 31st edition, so it's just over a week ago, of the New Yorker. An article entitled Hillary Clinton and the Populist Revolt. The subtitle will pretty much tell you the basic theme of the article. The Democrats lost the white working class. The Republicans exploited it. Can Clinton win it back? That's the theme of Packer's article. In it, he touches upon 3 or 4 of some of the most popular materials, books being written. Books like Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. Books like White Trash, 400 Years of Looking at the White Working Class in the West. Norman Mailer in his treatment of the 1968 presidential campaign, both Chicago and Miami. You may remember the riots in Chicago and the fact that the party turned its back on both Eugene McCarthy and George McGovern and ultimately gave the nomination to Hubert Humphrey in the ultimate of rigged conventions. And Humphrey made one heck of a run, if you remember. But the winner, of course, was Richard Nixon. And Norman Mailer covers the Republican convention in Miami that year when the nomination went to Richard Nixon. And Packer puts a number of these things into perspective and seems to connect them to our political elections, to some of our leading economic gurus like Alan Greenspan and Summers, former Treasury Secretary Summers, Robert Rubin, names that we've all heard about. It's just one of the best pieces that I've read in a long time. And hopefully, by the time we get into our second hour today, we'll be into a little bit of this. But I wanted to throw the name of the article and the source out there for you so that you could take a look at it yourself. Because we'll be in it for the next couple of days at least. It's that good, it seems to me. That's that much there. And of course, tomorrow, as you know, we'll have our abbreviated program. We only do 1.5 hours of live programming on Tuesdays, and we'll be back to that on Tuesdays. So we'll be beginning 1/2 hour later than today. But again, you might take a look at our Facebook page, and then finally my email address. If you'd like to communicate with me or communicate your ideas, get them on the air as it were, but you're not really comfortable going on the air yourself for whatever reason, and I can understand that, then if you drop me an email and share your thoughts with me, I'll do the very best I can to represent you on the air, represent your ideas, your thinking. I won't change it. I won't reinterpret it. I won't do anything. I will try as best I can to get the full sentiments on the air that prompted you to send the email. And I will acknowledge the receipt of your email at a minimum. And if I can add anything to it or respond to it in my, from my own background, I'd be glad to give that a try as well. My email address is waobrien906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 at gmail.com. Where to begin after not being here for almost 2 weeks? A lot's happened. The FBI report, the so-called FBI report from James Comey, that they had found some of Hillary Clinton's emails on Anthony Weiner's laptop, and that in effect they were reopening the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails issue. And then over this very past weekend, recently, the report late yesterday that there's nothing there, and that the FBI's conclusion from earlier that there is no evidence of anything that is indictable on the emails. And of course, the major implication, the major conclusion from all this is what impact did this action on the part of James Comey have on the election? There's no question that it's had an impact on the rolls, on the polls rather, probably on the rolls too, but on the polls. Because it looked like prior to the release 11 days ago of this letter that James Comey wrote to members of Congress, it looked like Hillary Clinton was pulling away in many states, and that many of the so-called toss-up states were trending in her direction, and it was beginning to look like they weren't going to be toss-up states at all. And then all of a sudden, that was brought to a screeching halt by James Comey when he sent this letter to Congress. And suddenly, the polls began to close again. And there seemed to be new enthusiasm and new vitality in the Trump administration. And it was recognized in the excitement and the enthusiasm so evident in his rallies, his many rallies. I think one of the things that all of us have to admire is his stamina. For a 70-year-old man, he's incredible. In fact, I was hearing on one of the talk shows this morning, could have been Morning Joe, I can't remember. I kind of flipped from one to, flip around to 2 or 3 different ones. But somebody who interviewed Donald Trump recently was talking about his day in a 24-hour period. And he said the guy's remarkable. He said at one point he walked into a hotel somewhere on the road, wherever it is, and Donald Trump was having dinner with his staff. And this was very late at night, close to 11:30, midnight. And then the next morning he went to a buffet in the hotel and Donald Trump was there. And he was eating, and then he was going to leave town, and he had 4 speaking engagements in 4 different states that day. And that night, he appeared fresh, vibrant. The guy's stamina is amazing. I can attest to how difficult some of these issues are when you're doing something during the day, and then you have to basically get all spiffed up to go to an event in the evening. You can do it once, but if you try to do it more than once, it becomes, more than 2 days, 2 days in a row, it becomes pretty taxing and pretty stressful. And he's handled it. I mean, his itinerary yesterday, 4 different states, one of them being Nevada. All the way out there and back. And it's just astounding. the schedule that he's running. And of course, Hillary is running a similar schedule, not quite as ambitious as his, but close. My guess is that one of the things we'll be thinking about or reading about after the election is over is the so-called, what many people are referring to as the Comey effect or the Comey incident. Because there's a distinct possibility that this could have a profound effect on the campaign. It doesn't seem to have had that much effect on the polls. It did at first. But the reports seemed to be that most of the polls were coming back, that Hillary's strength was coming back after the initial shock of the Comey letter. And so therefore, there didn't seem to be that much movement of people as a result of this particular issue. But there's absolutely no question. And then there's the other factor, which is the down ballot races. I heard somebody make the comment this morning that the FBI's behavior in this, if it had no other effect at all, could probably result in the Republican Party retaining 2 Senate seats that they might have lost, that they were looked to be in line to lose before the Comey letter surfaced. And if that's true, and if the Senate remains in Republican hands barely, then there's no question that in part, at least, it's very likely that the FBI behavior in all of this had an impact on that. And that gets us to an issue that I thought was really well worth a little bit of our time today. And that's an editorial in this morning's New York Times about the Supreme Court and about the Republican Party's continuing refusal to replace Antonin Scalia or to allow the president to replace Antonin Scalia. What prompts this issue, of course, is kind of an element or an example of, we can call it hypocrisy. To be kind, you can call it changing your mind. But however you classify it, however you phrase it, the fact of the matter is, when Scalia died earlier this year, and the Republican Party, especially in the person of the president of the Senate, the head of the majority in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, made the statement that Republicans in the Senate were not going to allow President Obama to nominate a replacement. And you may remember that they even took the position that they weren't even going to consider nominations for such a position. They wouldn't even look at the nominations or meet with a nominee. And you remember that President Obama did indeed appoint a long-term jurist for that seat. And most Republicans, members of the Senate, refused to meet with him. Some Democrats did, and eventually a couple of Republicans did. But the fact of the matter is that McConnell and the others refused to allow the Senate to take up the issue. And the rationalization was that they wanted to wait until after the election in order to give the American people the opportunity to weigh in on this important issue. Their position is it was unfair to allow the president to make an appointment to the Supreme Court in his last year in office. And that with the election coming the very next year, a new administration, a new president, it seemed only fair to forego action on a Supreme Court nominee until after the November elections. And throughout the balance of the summer and into the fall, that was the Republican position. There was a lot of political debate, a lot of consternation, a lot of anger and hostility over that issue, in the fact that the Republican Party seemingly was hijacking the court. There was a lot of focus on some of the issues that were going to come before the court and how those issues would fare in light of an 8-member Supreme Court rather than a Supreme Court with a 5-4 conservative majority. And into the fall campaign season, that was pretty much the position of the Republican Party until recently. And over the last couple of weeks, the Republican Party has changed its stance, probably based on the realities of the campaign, namely that it was looking more and more and more like Hillary Clinton was going to be the winner of the presidential election rather than Donald Trump. And that consequently, it was more and more likely that Donald Trump really was never going to get the chance to nominate anybody to the Supreme Court. It was going to be Hillary. And at that point, Republicans began to dig in their heels and take the position that if they had to, they would obstruct Hillary's effort to nominate a Supreme Court justice for the full 4 years of her term. And many prominent Republican senators jumped on this bandwagon. One of the most surprising is John McCain. I know in my own mind, I was extremely surprised that John McCain agreed with this position of what amounts to a Republican takeover of the Supreme Court. In other words, what they have done is backtrack on their commitment to give the American people a chance to have a say in the Supreme Court nomination by who they elect president. Once the polls began to show that it was beginning to look more and more like Hillary Clinton would be that person, the Republican leadership began to back off and rather decide that the American people weren't going to have a say in it at all, that only they were. And they were not going to let Hillary Clinton nominate a Supreme Court justice to fill the seat of Antonin Scalia if it took the whole 4 years of her term to pull that off. I happen to have a hard copy of the particular editorial or the article on the op-ed page in today's New York Times. And basically, I'm kind of struck by John McCain. John McCain in Arizona during a heated political campaign, he's had serious challenge in this campaign. On a local radio show in Arizona, McCain said recently, "I promise you that we will be united against any Supreme Court nominee that Hillary Clinton, if she were president, would put up." But it's not just members of the Senate. And the piece in the New York Times from the editorial board points out that some of the leading think tanks of the behind the Republican Party are jumping on board this position as well. One of them being the Cato Institute. 2 weeks ago, the Cato Institute wrote that it would be completely decent, honorable, and in keeping with the Senate's constitutional duty to vote against essentially every judicial nominee a President Clinton might name. Last Thursday, according to this editorial, the vice president of the Heritage Foundation said that Senators McCain, Burr of North Carolina, and Ted Cruz were taking exactly the right position, and that an effective long-term blockade of the court will require, quote, an immense amount of willpower from Senate Republicans. So here's the very conservative but still considered reputable Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute, both of them supporting the Republican blockade of the Supreme Court. Basically, what this does is this is the reason I raise it, is to turn the Supreme Court into a political branch of government, when in fact the whole point of separation of powers was to make sure that the Supreme Court never became political. It seems to me that to involve politics to this degree in the Supreme Court is a violation of the Constitution and the principles that many of these Republican leaders always claimed that they supported. Not only does it stymie the ability of the justices who are currently on the court to resolve current cases, it literally flies in the face of the court's only non-political branch of government. And going back to Federalist number 78, which is the Federalist paper where Hamilton really deals with the makeup and the structure and the duties of the Supreme Court, Hamilton pointed out that the Supreme Court had neither the sword nor the purse. And if you remember Federalist 78, Hamilton makes the point that the legislative branch, Congress, had the power of the purse as a weapon in order to get its way. The executive branch, the president's office, had the power of the sword, the administrative power of that particular office as chief administrator of the federal government, to use its influence that way. The Supreme Court had neither of those. And Hamilton made the point that the only power that the Supreme Court had was shared acceptance of its decisions, of its verdicts by the public. And by turning the court into a political football over this issue, the Republicans are challenging the credibility of the court in the eyes of American citizens. They're making it less and less likely that the American people are ever again going to look at the Supreme Court as really neutral and objective and non-political. And history tells us that this was one of the fallouts in the 19th century of the Dred Scott decision. It took the Supreme Court decades to overcome the fallout that the Supreme Court experienced over Dred Scott. Because in rendering the Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney had thrown the Supreme Court into the political debate raging in the nation at the time over slavery. Taney's position was that maybe the Supreme Court could resolve the issue and thereby prevent a civil war in the country. But the result was that the fallout from getting involved in that political decision was a negative that it took the Supreme Court decades to overcome. The American people lost their faith in the neutrality and objectivity of the Supreme Court as a result of that decision. And it took years to get it back. And now, given what the Republicans are doing, they are playing with the same element, the same fire, if you will, that the Supreme Court was involved in the Dred Scott decision more than a century ago. Basically, and I'm reading directly from the editorial, from this article this morning, today's Republicans are essentially saying the court is nothing but another political body, and that justices should be treated as ideological sock puppets of the president who nominated them. And then the editorial board of the New York Times goes into a little bit of a philosophical argument here and said, yes, the justices do come with political beliefs and political backgrounds, but that makes it all the more important to demand that they work harder than the rest of us to struggle against their biases and preserve their independence. This is why, for instance, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was wrong to comment on Donald Trump's candidacy, words for which she later apologized. And of course, everybody will remember the disputed election in 2000 when Al Gore conceded to George Bush's presidency as a result of the Supreme Court's 5-4 verdict in Bush versus United States of America case. Even though he opposed it, he accepted the Supreme Court's right to make the decision, and he encouraged the American people to do the same, and they did. This particular editorial board gives Al Gore credit for that. This being one of the most important decisions ever made by a presidential candidate. That the court must be seen as the final arbiter in the dispute, and that all of us must move on from that, he said. There were no riots in the streets, no attempted coups, no Second Amendment solutions that we're hearing about today. There was instead, the editorial reads, a peaceful transfer of power, the hallmark in a civil society operating under the rule of law. All of this is up for grabs as a result of the current behavior of the Republican Senate as we await the results of tomorrow's election. I think all of us need to be very, very aware of this and very concerned about it. Many Republican supporters of Donald Trump are saying that the major reason to support Donald Trump is the Supreme Court. And what they mean is to give Donald Trump the right and deny Hillary Clinton the right to make a Supreme Court nomination. In effect, then, all of this speaks to the political nature of the Supreme Court. And the result of that is that all of it reflects negatively on the court because it suggests that the court's decisions are more ideological and political than the system is designed to allow them to be. This is a major article on the op-ed page in today's New York Times. I think it's a very, very important issue. I think it's one all of us need to pay very, very close attention to. And I think if Hillary Clinton does win the presidency tomorrow, then this particular issue is going to be back with us in a big way. Because there's absolutely no question that filling this particular vacancy on the Supreme Court is going to be one of Hillary's priority decisions. She's not only going to make it firmly, she's going to make it fast. And right now, the Republican Party is threatening obstruction as none of us have ever seen a major political party do before. I think it's something that all of us need to pay attention to and all of us need to be aware of. That really is the first major issue that I wanted to deal with today. I believe it's so important. Let me just make this is commentary on my part as to why, and how I think that particular issue is so important. It not only deals with some of the cases pending before the court now, but it also suggests some of the decisions that have already been made that might be changed. Here in West Virginia, for example, all through this campaign, we've been bombarded with threats that a Hillary Clinton presidency is going to result in the federal government taking our guns. Hillary will take your guns, is what they're saying. The implication, of course, is that this is going to be some sort of an action by the federal government that is hostile to the rights of the American people, specifically the Second Amendment rights. Donald Trump has featured this in many of his rallies. He keeps talking about the Second Amendment. He's made sarcastic references to a Second Amendment solution to the problems posed by Hillary. And what that means is a solution to the problem she creates that involves guns. And in the minds of many people, that's a threat of physical violence. And of course, Donald Trump washes his hands and denies any of that. He's kind of skirting the edges there. But there's absolutely no question that this issue of taking your guns has been an undercurrent of the campaign throughout. Here on the Virtual Center, we spent several entire programs looking at the Heller decision. Justice Scalia's majority opinion in the Heller case a decade ago, from which the right to bear arms becomes the predominant interpretation of the Second Amendment. And not only did we consider Scalia's majority opinion in Heller, we also looked at Justice Stevens's 90-page dissenting opinion. And it was my conclusion, after reading significant portions of both of these decisions on the air, it was my conclusion, and it's the conclusion of a lot of legal minds who've looked at this issue, that the Stevens dissenting opinion is much more judicially sound in its reasoning than is Scalia. That in effect, the Scalia decision majority opinion in Heller is a classic example of judicial activism. And that's one of the things that Justice Stevens accuses Scalia of, accuses the majority of, is engaging in judicial activism, which is the position, the philosophical position, that conservatives have generally run against, stood against. In other words, they are practicing the very evil they always attack. And the reason for that, of course, is that Justice Scalia performed rhetorical hocus pocus, if you will, in order to reach the conclusion he did in Heller. Without going back into the details of the decision, let me remind you that the Second Amendment consists of two separate phrases. The first one dealing with the importance, the necessity of a well-regulated militia. The second phrase relating to the right to bear arms not being infringed. Justice Scalia used rhetorical magic in order to make the case that the second phrase in the Second Amendment was really the dominant phrase, and that the first phrase was so unimportant when compared to it that it could effectively be eliminated. Translation, in other words, what Scalia did was focus on only one half of the Second Amendment as the intent, as the meaning of the Second Amendment, and thereby effectively dismissing all the stuff about the well-regulated militia as being unnecessary and unimportant, and in fact asserting that this would have been the ruling of the founders if we had an opportunity to ask them. Justice Stevens, in his dissenting opinion, points out the hypocrisy of that particular decision. He challenges it. He comes up with all sorts of historical evidence and precedent to challenge it. He points out historically that throughout the history of British common law, as well as legalisms in this country, the right to bear arms has traditionally been associated with the well-regulated militia. The two go together. And to arbitrarily dismiss one in order to feature the other one was judicially unsound. But because the conservatives controlled the court 5-4, the Heller decision, the Scalia opinion, became the majority opinion. There's absolutely no question in my mind that at some future date, that decision is going to be revisited by a different Supreme Court. And if indeed a Hillary Clinton presidency would result in a Supreme Court appointment that would reverse the majority on the court from a 5-4 conservative majority to a 5-4 more moderate one, there's no question that that court might be very likely to welcome a challenge to Heller. and most likely reverse the decision in Heller. In effect, then, a Hillary Clinton presidency would be taking your guns away, wouldn't it? The irony of ironies is that's really not an idle threat. Because the fact of the matter is the right to bear arms as a God-given natural right comes to us as a result of Heller. It comes to us as a result of the mind and the rhetorical skills of Antonin Scalia. It does not come to us from the Creator. And since it came to us so recently by a 5-4 conservative majority, there's quite a bit of likelihood that it could be overturned by a majority with a 5-4 balance in the other direction. That's how important this particular election is. That's why I think McConnell and leading Republicans are pledging that they will dig in their heels and prevent a Hillary Clinton nomination coming for the Supreme Court for the entire 4 years that she's in office if she wins the election. That speaks to the significance of the rather shaky majority that the Republicans have in the Senate. And when the polls were showing that Hillary Clinton was extending her lead and that this election might indeed be a blowout, a landslide for Hillary Clinton, the thinking of the media was that this might mean a change in power in the Senate. Probably not the House, because the Republican control of the House is much more solid. The landslide would have to be huge in order to unseat Republican control of the House of Representatives. But the argument is that if the Democrats are successful in taking the Senate as well as the White House, and taking back some of the Republicans' power over the House of Representatives, the thinking is that it would be very, very likely that Speaker Ryan and the Republican leadership would have to take Democratic policies and Democratic positions much more seriously in getting things through the House. In other words, the Democratic Party would have much more influence over legislation coming through the House with a weakened Republican majority, even though it would still be a Republican-controlled branch of government. So I think all of this speaks to the importance of the decision tomorrow in terms of the Senate, the control of the Senate, and what that means in terms of the Supreme Court, what that means in terms of Heller, what it might mean on many of these other issues, right to life issues and various other things. This is pretty serious stuff, it seems to me. And many of these folks are taking it that way, are considering it to be very, very serious, as I do as well. That's one of the reasons I felt that we really can't go too long without having these programs, because it seems to me these programs pretty much keep us up to speed, or try to. I do the best I can to try to keep us up to speed on some of the major issues coming down the pike, especially in a major issue like this particular election of 2016. People have always talked about, every presidential year, people always talk about this being one of the most important elections ever in your lifetime and all of that. I think this one, the people who say that in this one are right on target. This one indeed does suggest a degree of importance that's been missing with the other ones. I know that Bill Maher on his program on HBO this past weekend made that point, and I think it was a point well taken. And he said people said that George Bush was the worst president ever and that the nation wouldn't survive the presidency of George Bush. And they said the same thing about Mitt Romney the last time around. But as Bill Maher said, the fact of the matter is most Democrats were crying wolf. Because as Bill Maher said, 4 years of a Mitt Romney presidency probably wouldn't have affected me that much. But this one will. And as he said, what Democrats did was make the mistake of crying wolf over and over again. Now, when there's a real wolf, people tend not to take the threat seriously. And I think just in terms of what we've looked at in the last half hour here, with Heller and all the rest of it, many of these are very, very, very serious issues, and all of them are on the line tomorrow. But both sides know it. I mean, there's absolutely no question. I think the behavior of the Senate only makes sense because the leadership knows exactly what's at stake in tomorrow's election. And that's why I felt it's vitally important that we get back on the air and that we continue to bring some of these programs to our listeners. Because I think, after a while, so many things happen from the last time that you were on the air. There's so many things have gone by, so much water's gone under the bridge, so to speak, that you almost don't know where to start in order to pick up. And it seemed to me that it was becoming more and more critical that we get back on the air and we try to get back to the business at hand here for which the virtual center was created. So that's really my point. That's what I wanted to accomplish in our first hour today, and I hope that we've done it. I obviously do invite your comments and your commentary. If you have something to say on these particular issues, by all means, give our listeners an opportunity to hear what you're thinking. Because again, the mere fact that you listen to this program suggests that you are thinking. And therefore, what you say has value. And that means that all of our people will benefit from hearing it and from recognizing it and thinking about it themselves and considering it as they try to put together the world that seems to make the most sense to them. So with that, I think we're right at the top of the hour. It's 58 minutes after the hour, and I think this is a good place to break for a 5-minute break and come back. And there are two things that I'd like to deal with in the second hour. The first one is one that we touched on the last time we were together before I took time off to pursue politicking a little bit more seriously than I had been up until then. And it basically deals with the issue of representation. And we touched on this a little bit a couple of weeks ago. I want to get back to it because I think it's very important. I know in my own case, in my own campaign, it's been particularly important. And one of the last pieces that I put in the local papers in my district was a position paper on the issue of representation and why I believe it's so important. We talked about it the last time we were together live here at the Virtual Center. I want to return to it because I think it's very important. The second issue, and I don't know how much of that we'll get to today, but I'd like to begin it if we can. And that is the George Packer issue in the New Yorker, in the October 31st New Yorker, on Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party's loss of the support of working people, of the so-called white working class, and whether in fact she can get it back or not. So those are the two issues that I'd like to deal with in our second hour. We obviously won't finish the second one, but hopefully we'll have time to finish the first. So again, you're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break. I encourage everybody to go out and enjoy some of this beautiful weather if it does indeed apply to the place where you happen to be listening. And take a couple of deep breaths of this wonderful, wonderful fall air. Get yourself a drink or whatever else you might do or need. And then in 5 minutes or so, we'll be back with our second hour. Please stay with us. Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center. We're at 6 minutes after the hour, 6 minutes after the hour of 2. In regular time, if daylight savings time ended this weekend, so we're back to, as my wife calls it, God's time. So, as she says, the animals know they don't practice daylight savings time and all that other stuff. They operate on the internal clock that they were born with, and we probably ought to be doing the same thing. But anyway, welcome to our second hour. If you were with us in our first hour, I want to thank you for staying with us. If you're just joining us, welcome. As you know, it's been close to 2 weeks since we've been live here at the Virtual Center. I've been involved in some more sustained campaigning over the last couple of weeks than I had done earlier, and I tried to maintain the programs as long as I could. But when we got to be 2 or 3 weeks before the election, it was just imperative that I start making some phone calls and knocking at some doors and sitting in the headquarters office in our Summers County and here in Raleigh County headquarters and be available to voters and meet voters and field phone calls and questions and that kind of thing. As some of the people over in Summers County have said over the last couple of days, it's one thing to have the office open so that if people want stickers or signs or whatever, they can get them. That's one thing. But when there's a candidate, one of the candidates is in the office, it makes it potentially much more valuable for constituents, because not only can they come into the office and get all of this paraphernalia and things and express themselves, but they have an opportunity to share thoughts on the particular campaigns themselves and to talk to the candidate, gain perspective on some of the issues and all of that. In other words, it's an opportunity to really engage in the kind of educational function associated with representation that James Madison intended and wrote about so brilliantly in the Federalist Papers. I want to take some time and go back over the phone number, because I do encourage folks to participate in the program, and this is a beautiful time to do it, because we really are shifting gears from one issue, the issue of the Supreme Court and the elections and the Heller decision, as we concluded our last hour with. Now we're going back into the issue of representation a little bit, and so we're right in between issues. And so if you are inclined to call, and some people have told me that they would call, but they didn't want to kind of get in the middle of an issue or break trains of thought or anything like that. And I encourage you not to worry about those things. That's hopefully I can handle that. But I appreciate the thought just the same. But right now is a perfect time, because we're not in the middle of anything. And so this would be a perfect opportunity to share your thoughts and your ideas. Again, our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. Agnes will pick up the phone in the head-on studios, and she'll let me know that you're on the air, and you'll be on. And it's that simple. So again, it's area code 304 663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to share your thoughts and ideas that way, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906. All one word, no spaces. Not capital letters, but small letters, at gmail.com. Then I'll try to do the very best I can to get your thoughts on the air for you. And again, I do encourage you to take a look at our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, the search box at the top of the homepage, and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be into our Facebook page, and there are a number of postings there that I've made. In fact, one that I put on there yesterday is a link to an article that I wanted to share with you over the weekend. It's another article that was, other than the one we're talking about, that was in the New Yorker magazine. The author of that is Adam. I'm trying to remember his last name. I'm kind of stuck for his last name. But the article was on the Trump candidacy, on the current election, and it was brilliantly done. And I put items on there because I've heard a number of people talk about what they perceive as the threat of Donald Trump and the kinds of circumstances. And this particular article makes that point and quotes Melania Trump during a radio interview when in response to a question, she made the point that her husband, that Donald Trump was not Adolf Hitler, was not Hitler. And the response in this article was that if you look back in history, Hitler wasn't Hitler until he became Hitler. In other words, once the opportunity presented himself, then all the authoritarianism and all the power and all the bigotry and all the hatred and all the rest of it that was within him came out. And so basically what this article is about are the circumstances that can produce the kinds of vitriol and the kinds of hate and lack of civility and all the rest of it that we're all seeing. And it's very, very similar to the situation that existed in Germany in the 1930s. And in fact, on the Facebook, I made the point, if many of you may remember George Orwell's Animal Farm and the takeover of power on the farm by the animals, by the pigs. And you may remember the argument that they made as to why the animals on the farm had no choice but to give them as much power as was possible because only they could protect the farm and the animals on it from the serious threats that were out there lurking. And it's exactly the same kind of situation that Donald Trump presents. If you've read Animal Farm, you know what I'm talking about. That fear coupled with propaganda can lead to a tremendous accumulation of power. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. And that's the argument that this particular piece makes. So if you go to our Facebook page, I think you'll see some of my comments on that particular piece. But the piece that we dealt with here, of course, was a piece on the Supreme Court and the extent to which the new president, if it's Hillary Clinton, is going to be denied the opportunity to make a Supreme Court nomination, and how prominent Republicans are jumping on that position, which really reverses their previous position, which is they wanted to wait until after the election so that the American people could speak on that issue. Well, now that they are concerned that the American people might speak in ways that they don't want them to speak, now they're basically promising to obstruct a Clinton presidency for the full 4 years of its existence. So that was kind of what we dealt with in our first hour, for those of you just joining us. And as I mentioned, in our second hour, I'd like to begin by going back to an issue we were into a little bit in the last time that we were together live here at the Virtual Center. And that's the issue of representation. And to go back very quickly and not spend a lot of time on this, at the time when we first approached this a couple of weeks ago, I made the point that the issue of representation had come up in my own campaign. And I was seeing it, and I was drawn back into the sources, into the founders, into Madison, and into some of the British, Edmund Burke in England, and many of the other positions on representation, because of issues that I was seeing in my own campaign. And I began to talk about representation, and my presentation, for the most part, was focused pretty much on the local situation here, on particular issues that I was seeing. And to be very quick about it, because I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, because this is local. This pertains pretty much to where I'm speaking from, which is southern West Virginia. Basically, my campaign was focused on some of the behavior, some of the policies and programs that have been pushed in our legislature here in West Virginia by the new Republican majority that took over control of the Senate in the last election and in the House two elections ago. West Virginia is now a solidly red state. If you look at the maps, the projection maps for tomorrow's election, you will see that West Virginia is painted bright red, dark red. It is unquestioned. It's not leaning Republican. It is Republican. And Donald Trump is incredibly powerful here, and he'll carry the state. Absolutely no question. That's not the issue. The issue for me as a candidate for the legislature here in West Virginia are the policy and program issues that the new Republican majority has been pushing in the legislature. And the way I focused on those was through the prism, if you will, through the perspective of representation. And the last time we were together, I was talking about the theory, the idea of representation in a popular government. And I had specifically made mention of Edmund Burke, because Edmund Burke has left us the classic definition of representation in our form of government, what the role of the representative is. Many people use the term democracy, and they use it loosely. They talk about representative government or Republican government and democracy interchangeably, when in fact they are not interchangeable at all. They mean quite different things. To the founders, democracy was a negative word. It was a bad word because it meant specifically majority rule. It meant power in the hands of the majority, principally because they were the majority. And in a majority rule popular government, if the majority is able to seize power and organize itself, it will directly control policy making. It will directly control what government does. That's democracy. In ancient Greece, in Athens, if you remember, all the citizens, and again, we know that everybody wasn't eligible to be a citizen or to vote. But all those eligible to vote, all those classified as citizens, would gather in the outdoor theater or in the arena, and they would debate and vote on issues. This was direct democracy. The majority would carry the day. In this country, the Constitution of the United States replaces anything resembling, and I use those words advisedly, I'll be back to them, to replace anything resembling democracy with what is called Republican government. And the founders, James Madison specifically, in the Federalist Papers defined Republican government as government in which the idea of representation takes place. The people don't directly make the laws. The people elect the people who make the laws. But the fact of the matter is, if there is an organized majority, then the majority has the opportunity to instruct the elected representative. In other words, there really is no difference between direct democracy, a la ancient Greece, and representative democracy, which can exist when the majority is organized and able to exercise its will as the majority faction. And that's what Madison writes about in Federalist Number 10, how dangerous the majority faction is, because it smacks of direct democracy. It puts power in the hands of the majority of the people. Madison and the other founders believed, all of them, that the majority of the people was the one place you didn't want to locate power. Because the majority of the people, for the most part, were always driven by self-interest, not the public interest. What you had to do, Madison argued, was find a way to educate, to identify and educate a group of people who would be representatives of the interests of the people, but at the same time, they would have the wisdom and the foresight and the insight to make the right decisions on behalf of the people. They would be what Madison called in Federalist Number 10, the most considerate and virtuous citizens. They would be the people able to put aside self-interest and local interests in favor of the national interest. And therefore, Madison believed you had to get these people out there as candidates for the votes of the people. The people needed to participate. They needed to feel part of the process. They needed to vote. They needed to have a say in the choice of the representative. But Edmund Burke's position was that at the 11th hour, when it comes time to make a decision, the representatives must make the decision with full knowledge of the needs and wants of their constituents. In other words, representative government means that the representative has an obligation to represent the interests and the will of constituents, but not give them the authority to make the decision. In fact, Edmund Burke makes the point, to do that, to give them the authority, is to thwart the talents and the ability of the elected representatives, the very thing that got them elected in the first place. You elect them for their ability, for their insights, for their skills, for their education, for their experience, for their wisdom. And then you deny them the right to make decisions? That didn't make any sense to Edmund Burke. So Burke's argument is the people need to be heard, but the representatives together need to make the decisions. And that's the argument he made in a speech to the electors of Bristol in England in 1774. And if you can remember from the last time we were together, we looked at a couple of paragraphs from that particular speech. And I'd like to share those with you once again. In that speech, Edmund Burke says the following: "Certainly, gentlemen, it ought to be the happiness and glory of a representative to live in the strictest union, the closest correspondence, and the most unreserved communication with his constituents. The representative must be in regular, close, constant contact with those he would represent. Their wishes ought to have great weight with him, their opinions high respect, their business unremitted attention. It is his duty to sacrifice his repose, his pleasures, his satisfactions to theirs. And above all, ever, in all cases, to prefer their interests to his own. What the people need and want and believe must be given the weight that these things warrant. The people have a right to be heard. That's what representation is all about, Burke says. But his unbiased opinion, his mature judgment, his enlightened conscience, he ought not to sacrifice to you, to any man, or to any set of men living. These he does not derive from your pleasure, no, nor from the law and the Constitution. They are a trust from Providence, for the abuse of which he is deeply answerable. Your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment, and he betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices that judgment to your opinion. The elected representative owes you his ear and his judgment and his wisdom and his intelligence. But he doesn't owe you the right to make the decision. To do that would violate the reason you elected him in the first place. That's Edmund Burke's classic definition of representation. That's the view of representation that the founders adopted. That's the view of representation that is reflected in the Constitution of the United States. And that's the definition of representation that Madison defends in the Federalist Papers that he devotes specifically to the issues of representation. Specifically, Federalist number 39. I've been talking about Federalist number 10, where Madison talks about the dangers of the majority faction. Now he's talking about the nature of representation itself. And he says, quote, "The first question that offers itself is whether the general form and aspect of the government be strictly Republican. It is evident," Madison says, "that no other form would be reconcilable with the genius of the people of America. The only kind of government that would be consistent with the will and the wisdom of the people of America is a republic, a Republican form of government. It's the only government that would reflect the genius of the people as well as the fundamental principles of the Revolution and the honorable determination which animates every votary of freedom to rest on all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. If we are going to have self-government, then we must maintain a republic." And then Madison says in the last sentence of this particular paragraph, which is near the beginning of Federalist number 39, "If the plan of the convention, the Constitution, therefore, be found to depart from the Republican character, its advocates must abandon it as no longer defensible." If people can prove, if we can be shown that the Constitution of the United States does not adhere to Republican government but violates it, then the Constitution must not be ratified. That's what Madison says. So the rest of Federalist number 39 then is Madison's effort to make clear that the Constitution of the United States does indeed adhere to Republican government. What then, he says, are the distinctive characters of the Republican form? If the Constitution must be Republican, what does that mean? And then Madison goes through a number of historical examples. He goes to Holland. He goes to different states. He goes to Venice in Italy. He touches on the government of England. And he points out that in every one of these, there are examples of governments that don't exactly operate the same way, yet all of them qualify as republics, as Republican government. So the question is, what is the definition of Republican government? And Madison then addresses that issue. And he says, if we resort for a criterion to the different principles on which different forms of government are established, we may define a republic to be, or at least may bestow that name on, a government which derives all its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure, for a limited period or during good behavior. That is Madison's definition of Republican government. Republican government, Madison says, is a government which derives all or some of its powers, all of its powers, directly or indirectly from the great body of the people, and is administered by people elected to office, holding office during the pleasure or during good behavior. In other words, they are not lifetime appointees. As representatives of the people, their terms must have limits, must have an end. They are not kings. They don't maintain power or the right to power so long as they live. They are people who owe their power and their positions to the voters, to the great body of people that elected them. Not just the ones who voted for them, but all of those who voted for them or against them. And that's important. What that means is that when you vote, you are acknowledging your willingness to live with the results of the election, even if your candidate doesn't win. So your vote does matter. It signifies your willingness to go along with the result of the election. You don't have the right to support the result if you win and to challenge the result if you don't. And I think you know where I'm coming from there. That's really the position that Donald Trump has taken during a portion of this primary. So that's what Republican government is to Madison. It's a government that derives all of its power, either directly or indirectly, from the great body of people, and is administered by people holding offices during good behavior or during pleasure. In other words, as long as the people vote to keep them in office. But it is not a lifetime appointment. Madison goes on and clarifies even more. It is essential to such a government that it be derived from the great body of the society, not from an inconsiderable proportion or a favored class of it. That is critically important. The key to Republican government is that government must be derived from the great body of the society. It must represent all the people, not just some of the people, not just a few, not just a favored class within society, all of society. Otherwise, Madison says, a handful of tyrannical nobles exercising their oppressions by a delegation of their powers might aspire to the rank of republicans and claim for their government the honorable title of republic. It is sufficient for such a government that the persons administering it be appointed, or either directly or indirectly by the people, and that they hold their appointments by either the tenures just specified. Otherwise, every government in the United States, as well as every other popular government that has been or can be well organized or well executed, would be degraded from the Republican character. It doesn't matter whether the office holder is elected or appointed. The key is that their power must come from the people, all the people, not just some of the people. The key here, it seems to me, is that the elected representative represents all the people, not just the people who vote for him, not just the property owners, not just the wealthy, not just the highly educated, not just the military, all the people. When you have a situation where only a group of people dictates what government does, that violates the Republican principle. That means you no longer have a republic. But again, it doesn't have to be direct representation of the people. It can be indirect. But the power, the right to rule, must come from the people, and the people must have the right to take it back. That's the key. So when we consider things like Citizens United and the role that big money plays in our elections, and the fact that elections can be bought, candidates' loyalty, their votes can be bought because their campaigns are funded by special interests, then you are really tampering with the very substance of Republican government. You are fooling with a violation of the very principle of representation. That's what I found here in West Virginia. That's what I'm running against. That's what I see happening in Charleston in our legislature. In the piece that I published locally here, I had 9 particular pieces of legislation that the legislature spent significant time on during its last 60-day session. And every one of those pieces of legislation, every one of those proposed laws was written outside West Virginia. In no way did they reflect the will of the people of West Virginia. They were shipped in here courtesy of the American Legislative Exchange Council. They dealt with religious freedom. They dealt with a pledge on never to support taxes, a tax increase. They dealt with right to work. They dealt with prevailing wage. They dealt with cuts in the size of government. They dealt with a commitment to public employees for health insurance. They dealt with the retirement funds of public employees. They dealt with commitments to working people in unions, miners and their families who were promised health care and benefits for their lives through their retirement. And now, for financial reasons, budget reasons, government is contemplating going back on those commitments. All of these things come from out of state. They are political issues for special interests and elites which aren't even here. And they are dictating the behavior of our legislature. They are laying out an agenda of proposed legislation which is going to be imposed upon our citizens. And instead of being consulted and represented at the table, our citizens are going to be told what these are after they become law. They are going to be communicated with, but only when it's too late to do anything about it. They are not being consulted before the fact. They are being brought into the picture after the fact. This is not representation. It is a violation of representation. It involves the bastardization of representation. It insults representative government. It insults the founders. It violates the oath of office that elected representatives took to represent the interests of their constituency. It involves elected representatives who are willing to put aside the interests of the people they represent in favor of people and interests they don't even know. Big money, heavily corporate funded organizations like the American Legislative Exchange Council, funded by groups like Koch Industries and major corporate interests like ExxonMobil and Phillips and many of the other industries that fund the American Legislative Exchange Council. They are drafting legislation, shipping it to state legislatures that they control, and giving it to their legislative leadership to run it through local legislatures and make this state law. And once that happens, then the people are being informed. This is what we did for you. And my position is, no, this is what we're doing to you. In order for representation to really function, the people need to be brought into the picture and consulted before these things become law, not only afterwards. That's what Madison defended. That's republicanism. That's the Constitution of the United States. That's what the founders created. That's what we must preserve. That's what we must bring back. That's what's on the table in this election. And I think, going back to our first hour, the behavior of members, Republican members of the Senate, in refusing to honor the will of the people in choosing the next president of the United States, by denying the winning candidate, if it happens to be Hillary Clinton, the opportunity to exercise the legitimate power of appointing members, nominees to the Supreme Court with the advice and consent of the Senate. The Senate does not have the right to refuse its advice and consent. That violates their oath. They have an obligation to act on the appointees of the president. They do not have the right to blackball all nominees before they're even made, because to do that is infringing on the constitutional powers of the president, and they don't have the right to do that. but they are taking it. And they are making the case to the people that they should have a right to do that. And they don't. They are violating the Constitution of the United States. And the local legislatures are violating their oath of office when they make citizens aware of what they've done only after they've done it. And that's the issue that I've run into here in West Virginia with my opponents. And I have made it a very, very important part of my campaign. I don't have any doubt that my opponent in this election is a good guy. I don't know him that well. But people that I've met on the campaign trail and people whom I trust have told me that they've known him for a long time and he's a good guy. I'm willing to accept that. But that does not justify what he's allowing to happen, what he's a party to, what he's participating in. He is violating the very substance of representative government in this nation. And he's running and asking the people for their support so he can keep doing it. And he has to be stopped. They all have to be stopped. If they don't, our government is doomed. That's what this election's about. It's not a question of good guys and bad guys. It's a question of principles and policy. It's a question of responsibility. It's the very substance of the Constitution of the United States itself that is at issue here. That's, in a nutshell, that's why I'm running. I hope I win. I believe that if there's any kind of divine justice, I should, because I believe my positions to be sound. But if I don't, then I have to obviously support the will of the people. But the reason that the virtual center is so important is because of the educational function that it provides. My goal, my challenge, my responsibility is to try to continue to educate people on the nature of this republic and on the frame of government which created it and the intent of the people who wrote it and voted for it. It's important that people know and become familiar with the evidence, because there are people out there who are misinterpreting that evidence. They are telling them things that aren't true. In many cases, they don't know that they aren't true. They're being told they aren't true by people who have agendas, who have their own personal agendas. And they believe them. They therefore become the agents of fraud, of demagogues. These are demagogues. These are people who have their own agenda, and their goal is to get the people to subscribe to their agenda. And the only way they can do that is to convince the people that their priority goals is the people's agenda. They are fashioning themselves as supporters and representation of the people, as populists, as spokesmen for the people. But in reality, they are using the people to get what they want for their own agenda. That's really what's going on. And it has to be stopped. It's being well funded. And the Supreme Court let them do it with Citizens United. It becomes very difficult to educate the citizenry when big money is being spent educating the citizenry to a whole different agenda of truths. Propaganda. Example. This past weekend, a story emerged on Fox News during the program of the host named Bayer. I can't remember his first name because I don't watch him all the time. And basically the argument was that the FBI inside report had it that the FBI was virtually ready to indict Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump took that at his next rally and announced to the people in that audience that it has been reported by a major network that Hillary Clinton is going to be indicted by the FBI. Therefore, you can't vote for her because you would be voting for somebody who's under indictment. Later on Friday, Fox News rescinded that story and acknowledged that they had been wrong. They hadn't checked the evidence. There was no evidence to support that, and there was not an indictment coming against Hillary Clinton at any time. That night, on the program called The 11th Hour on MSNBC, Kellyanne Conway, Donald Trump's campaign manager, was asked whether Donald Trump also would rescind the statements he made about the indictment because Fox News had done so. And Kellyanne Conway's response was no, because Donald Trump's goal is to run against Hillary Clinton. Her purpose is to hurt Hillary Clinton. This particular report hurt Hillary Clinton. The goal was achieved. There's nothing to take back. He hurt her, and that's what the campaign is about. Translation, it doesn't matter whether what we say is true or not as long as it works, as long as we win. My God! Think about that. Think about that. We can just keep lying and lying and lying and manipulating public opinion as much as we want, because the only thing that matters is that we win. And whatever we have to do to win is legitimate. We don't have to apologize for anything. My God. Germany in the 1930s. Hitler and the Big Lie. Mein Kampf. Say it over and over again as often as you can, and the mere fact that you do that makes it true. We've seen it with climate. We've seen it with sugar. We've seen it with the burning of fossil fuels. We've seen it with coal. We've seen it over and over again. denying science, denying reality, manipulating evidence, manufacturing evidence to counter real evidence. All of it perpetrating huge lies in order to manipulate public opinion so that they will go along with your agenda. And all that matters is that you win. And whether it's true or not no longer matters. I thought, I've always been told, and I've always read, that the conservative position was always one that endorsed the validity of absolutes. Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind. The challenge to American society in the late 20th century, that truth was becoming relative, that relativism was replacing truth. And it was manipulating and messing up the minds of our young people. That our young people had to be brought back to the realization that there are certain things that are absolutes. There are certain truths that we must never question or challenge. Now, today, here is that same party, political party, claiming that all that matters is that you win. Whether you have to lie to do it or not, it doesn't matter. You don't have anything to apologize for, even if you know what you said is a lie. How in the name of heaven do we expect to preserve the structure and the nature of representative government under this Constitution with that kind of position on the ballot and asking the American people to vote for it and to endorse it when they don't even know what it is? They don't even know what the truth is. Because the people that they rely on to give them the truth don't care. It doesn't matter anymore. That's the issue. That's the issue of this campaign. That's the issue of what's going to happen at the polls tomorrow. That's the story. It seems to me that if you put both hours of our program together today, I approached them as if they were totally separate subjects. But in fact, they are all part of one subject. Basically, that's our program today. We are at 58 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you. Most important, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here doing a live program. I don't think anything that I might have done on this, the last day before the election itself, could have been more important than this one. So with that, let me say thank you. Let me encourage all of you to vote. Please vote. I don't want to get philosophical here at this last minute, but please be aware that deciding not to vote is a vote. So please vote. If you don't vote, you are conceding power to the people you don't support. You don't want to do that. Hopefully we'll be back together again tomorrow. Remember, we start 30 minutes later tomorrow than today. This is Bill O'Brien. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Have a good day. Have a good evening. Love each other. Enjoy the weather. Please vote, and thank you.